As a photojournalist, he's traveled to more than 80 countries, often on assignment for some premier publications. David Burnett is my special guest next on I Remember. Hi, I'm Jim Peck. Welcome to I Remember. Joining me tonight is photojournalist David Burnett. Today we're on location at the VP Gallery in Milwaukee's 3rd Ward. On exhibit are some of the remarkable images he captured of the late reggae star Bob Marley. As a photojournalist, Burnett has covered subjects all over the world. Take a look.
David Burnett was the last photojournalist to cover America's war in Vietnam for Life magazine. He was in Chile in 1973 following the military coup against the government. His photographs in 44 Days were taken during the Iranian Revolution. He was in Tehran as the monarchy ended with the exile of the Shah and the return of Ayatollah Khomeini. 10 years later, in 1989, he was in Germany to witness the fall of the Berlin Wall. In Africa, David looked into the eyes of a young soldier fighting for liberation in Eritrea. Burnett has focused not only on animosity, but athletics. He's covered many sporting events, including the Summer Olympics since 1984. He's photographed world leaders, as well as politicians running for the U.S. presidency. He's been on the long campaign trail and has seen the smiles on election night. His photographs include every American president from JFK in the 60s through the inauguration of Barack Obama. In 1976, while on a Time magazine assignment in Jamaica, he spent time with Bob Marley. The next year, he covered the reggae star's Exodus tour in Europe for Rolling Stone magazine. On display in Milwaukee are some of the images from his book Soul Rebel, an intimate portrait of Bob Marley.
Why, of all the people in the world, Bob Marley?
Well, I'm as a freelance photojournalist and have been doing that for 40 years. I have had the joy and the pleasure of receiving what I used to refer to as the magic phone call. I'd be home, usually in New York, but sometimes it would happen on the road, and the phone rings, and then there's an editor on the other end. What are you doing? Well, nothing right now. What do you got cooking? Well, we want you to go to Jamaica and do a story on reggae. And to which I said, what's that?
Yes.
So I'm actually lucky because I get to be ignorant when I jump into stories and then kind of learn things as I go forward.
Gosh, that's a career I could have pursued in that case.
You know, ignoramus, that was what I did
Did you
well.
know anything about reggae or Bob Marley?
I had seen the one movie that was done about Jamaica in 1973, 74, The Harder They Come, but I had no idea what reggae was. I'd never honestly heard of Bob Marley. It was just, you know, the funny thing is in 1976 in the US, reggae was really just being explored for the first time. And it was, if you traveled to the Caribbean, you knew about it, and you knew that there was more than calypso and more than ska, but that reggae was this new musical genre. I was not that up on it yet. But the great thing is about, you know, being a photographer and your mission is to kind of parachute into these other worlds. I went with a reporter to Jamaica, and we spent 4 or 5 days up on the North Coast with half a dozen different bands, met these folks and listened to them play, and I was just shooting pictures the whole time. And along the way, everybody we talked to in the business, record executives, other band members, and just kind of people who we would run into, eventually would tell you or ask you, when are you going to see Bob Marley? And all these arrows kind of met in Kingston when we finally got there a couple of days later, and we went and spent a day with Bob.
What was he like?
Great. Couldn't have been any more welcoming to us. He was, it was not a big deal. We arrived with, I think, one handler from Island Records whose mission really was just to get us there, because it's easy to get lost in Kingston if you don't know where you're going. But Bob was just there, and it was like, come on in, sit down, let's reason, let's talk. And we spent pretty much most of the afternoon there just hanging out. And I was with a reporter, a guy named David DeVos, who well understood that in order for his story to run, there had to be some pictures. And I've always kind of understood the whole thing that my pictures need good words in order to make the pages as well. So during his interview, I was kind of free to just float around like a butterfly and just make my pictures. And that's where a lot of the photographs came from. The portraits were kind of from that session. And I was just basically hanging out with Bob for a couple hours.
Was he a good subject?
Great subject, very intense, but his eyes, when you look into his eyes, there's an intensity that's really striking. And
Is that what makes a good subject, by the way?
Well, you know, it's nice when people have a certain force to their personality, and that at least gives you something to reach for and something that you want to try to grab or to grab onto. For Bob, certainly, by the time I got to Kingston, I'd been in Jamaica. You know, by then I was a big expert. I'd been there all of about 5 days.
Certainly.
And by then, I think I kind of felt I was looking for something that really was going to get inside the look or the head of this guy and what he was all about. And the thing was, he was so unfull of pretension that there weren't any walls up. And if I just kind of wander around and look for a good angle, and I'm always thinking, I'm listening to the interview in one ear, but my other side of my brain is, how's the light? Is it a little too shadowy here? Do I need to go that way? Whereas, how about the profile?
You said he didn't have walls up. How does one put up a wall to a photographer?
Well, people can stiff you visually. I mean, they can look at you. I mean, not that that wouldn't be a picture, but I mean, they can, if people get uptight, I mean, I don't know how many times I've been on an assignment to get a portrait of somebody, and you walk out of there thinking, God, have I ever seen anybody so uptight in my whole life? They're just kind of, this is how they want to be photographed, and this is how they look. And it's like you want to reach over and tickle them a little bit or something to kind of break that spell. But,
do you ever do anything like that?
There's a famous story about Joseph Karsh with Churchill, that great picture of Churchill where Churchill had been, he's like this, he's got him posed just right, and he's got the cigar, but he doesn't have really that look that he wants, and Karsh goes over and just plucks the cigar out of Churchill's hand, and Churchill really gives it to him. Bang, that was the picture. I'm trying to think if I've ever had anybody that rose to the level of the Churchill cigar. I don't think so.
Or that your courage rose to the level of yanking it out.
Yeah, that's really, that's the hard part. How do you, am I really going to tick off the leader of the free world? Or I did go toe-to-toe with a bunch of Mikhail Gorbachev's bodyguards during an interview.
Ooh.
And Time magazine had an interview with him in maybe 1991. And typical Kremlin style would be the photographer, even if you were with the people doing the interview, you'd get your 15 seconds when they sit down, and then they come over and they kind of, peace and friendship aside, you're out of here. Mm-hmm. And the interview had started, and fortunately it had to go through a translator. They didn't do consecutive where they had the earphones. It was just sitting there, and a guy would take in the Russian and spit it out in English. And that meant that each side had these little pockets where they had nothing to do while their words were being translated. And so Gorbachev sees me being stiffed by the guard, and I'm just telling the guard, I've come all the way from New York, I'm not leaving yet. And I actually started, and we had kind of worked it out with the writers that I was going to make a little bit of a scene because I didn't want to leave that early. And finally Gorbachev just kind of gave him the old, let him stay, he's okay. And then actually as the interview went on, and he had this time to waste, his words were being translated, he'd kind of look up at me, and I'd kind of give him that, yes, Mr. Gorbachev, and do the old Groucho thing, and then he'd kind of give me that, well, Mr. Photographer, and we had our eyebrows had a conversation there that was parallel to the actual interview. And when it was over, and they were again trying to shepherd us out of the room, I said, please, I grabbed our translator, and I said, please ask the Premier if he would just stand by this window here for a moment, and I shoot a couple of pictures of him looking out the window. And so he got him to stand there, and after he heard a couple of clicks, he started to turn around, and I reached over, and he's a pretty beefy guy, Gorbachev. And I just put my hand on his shoulder and said, Mr. Secretary. And obviously, he didn't really know what I was saying, but what the gist of my voice was saying was, we're not quite finished yet. I need you back there for just a couple more. And I had to, And I pushed him back there and made a couple of shots. I look over out of the corner of my eye, I see the Time bureau chief, who's kind of like, "You're not supposed to touch the premiere."
It's lucky you got that hand
Yeah,
back.
but that was, there were no cigars involved, but I really, I have to say, I got a cover picture out of it.
Wow,
Worked pretty well.
you also photographed the Ayatollah Khomeini.
I did.
What was that like? He scares me. I mean, I look at pictures of him, even now that he's been gone for a long time, he scares me.
You know, he had a stern quality. I mean, stern maybe doesn't really begin to describe
Yes.
it, but I had not ever photographed him prior to his return to Tehran. I had been in Tehran since Christmas of 1978. He came back about a month later, and I remember my first impression of seeing him from a distance at the airport was, he really looks like his pictures. You know, not everybody does. A lot of people don't really look like their photographs when you get up close to him. He really did. He had that laser stare that just, you know, you think he could probably cut steel with those eyes.
Probably, yes.
And he had set up headquarters in a little school in Tehran, and I was trying to, every day I would go there and I'd fight my way into the crowd and be with the crowd, and they had these big crowds, and he would come and wave at the window and people would cheer, and it was a pretty interesting scene. But after a couple of days of doing that, I really felt I wanted to be on the inside looking out and to see what that was like and just to get closer. And there was a poor, unfortunate economics professor who had been given the job of dealing with the foreign press. He didn't really know what that was about, but he was a nice guy. But since he didn't have anything to offer, he never really had any insights into what was going on or any information. Most of the press stopped going to his briefings by the end of the second day. So I kept going back every morning, and I would plead to be, try and get in, and we've done these great pictures outside here. And finally, I think I just wore him down, and after 4 or 5 days, he just said, "Come on, let's go." And we wandered through the bowels of the school, and we get to this little doorway, and you can almost hear the building shake from the cheering of the people outside, 15,000 people, and you know, it's a noise you can kind of feel almost more than you can hear. I took my shoes off, and the door opened, and I walk in, and there, in this absolute serenity, is Ayatollah Khomeini sitting on the floor with another mullah kneeling down with a tray, picking up his teacup. I mean, it couldn't have been more of a contrast than what was going on outside. So that's really what I was looking for in those pictures. You know, sometimes...
Was he a good subject? Did he
was
smile
great.
at you?
Well,
or?
he didn't. No, actually, I do have a picture of him smiling, which is one of the very few pictures you will ever see.
I'd buy that in a heartbeat.
Of the, well, we can arrange that.
Funny that I mentioned it.
The thing is, he was, and what I always try and do is to just disappear. For me, I'm not someone who likes to make up pictures so much as I like to just grab a moment that is happening there. I want to witness it, I want to see it, I don't really want to affect it. Now, we're all products of the great theorem in physics, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, where we see that the observation of an event, by its very nature of the observation, changes that event. You know, the presence of a camera or a TV camera will change what we're looking at. But in this case, you know, it was one of those things where I got into the room and Khomeini was there, and it was a little room about 8 by 10 feet maybe, and I just kind of slunk, if that's a word, slinked
It is now.
back into the corner away from him and slid down on my haunches and just waited. And I didn't want to be noticed, I didn't want to be thrown out, and I just wanted to blend in. And I actually, a few years ago, I had the neatest compliment paid to me. When George Mitchell had been the Democratic Senate leader about 10 years ago, I spent some time with him for a Life magazine story. And his press person, I ran into her at a party a couple of years later, and she said, "Oh, this is Dave Burnett. He's the guy who walks into a room and disappears." I thought, that is, for a photographer, that is a pretty nice way of being introduced.
You witnessed the taking of one of the most famous photographs of all time in Vietnam.
Right.
The little girl running out after having been napalmed.
Right.
Did you ever wish you'd taken that picture?
You know, that's one of those things where people ask about that a lot, because we all kind of have, I guess we all have sort of photo envy or something. It's like, oh, I could have taken that picture, or I could have taken a better picture. I have a very fatalistic point of view about most things, photographic speaking. I mean, in a way, I think, especially when there's a news event involved, it's kind of meant to be. You know, I was the whole long and kind of boring backstory is that I had an old 1930s knob-wind, very slow to be able to load film in it, Leica. And I had jammed the film in my Leica, and while this whole thing is taking place, the planes are coming in, dropping the napalm, I was trying to load this camera. And when the planes came in, I took 1 or 2 shots, and then I'd go back to try and get the camera loaded. And at the moment that we started to first see this group of people running out on the road, running toward us, and that's the moment that Nick Utt, who made the picture that you refer to, Nick just immediately understood what happened, and he took off down the road. And it took me another probably 15 or 20 seconds to get the camera loaded. And then I took off, and I went off to take my pictures. Now, at that point, it was a scene that had probably played out many times in Vietnam where civilians had been injured. And there was just this moment as the kids were running away and Nick was running forward, and he made that one picture. It was just a moment that was, if it was ever going to be, it was meant to happen inside his Leica. And what was interesting is that later that afternoon, I went back to the AP office. He was an AP photographer, and still is, actually, 35 years later.
Wow.
Still doing great work. But I went back to the AP to get my film processed, and while I was waiting for my film, Nick came out of the darkroom with the first little 5x7 print, still wet from the hypo clear, holding it in his hand, and we're all kind of looking at it. And you know, at that point, we're the first eyes to actually see this picture.
Did you know how special it was?
Well, you know, I think we all thought, boy, that's a pretty good picture. And I know I thought, well, that's better than anything I have. That's a better picture than anything I made today, but yeah, that's good. And of course, you know, for Nick, his boss just said, you know, you did good work today, Nick. Go send it to, put it on the wire. And that's what, you know, the wire did. That's just get the picture out. So I went back to the office. I was then a Life magazine contract photographer, and I wrote up a little note saying, I've just been up to Trang Bang, and here's what happened. And by the way, Nick Utt from AP took a really good picture, and contact AP in New York. They'll have the negative in a couple of days, and you can get a print from them rather than have to use a wire service
Which
print.
is like faxing.
And what, to me, the most amazing thing that happened was that by the next day, when maybe 1 billion people had seen that picture because it was in every newspaper in the world, at that point it started to become the picture that we know it is now. But in the very beginning, it was another great photograph of a horrible thing that had happened in this war, of which there were a lot of good photographs. But there was something about the dire quality of the kids and the frightful look on their faces.
You followed up with that young lady, didn't you?
Just a year ago, for
Kim
the first time, I met Kim Phuc. A German television station had brought Nick in from Los Angeles, Kim from Toronto, and I was in Washington. And we all got together for the first time. I see Nick occasionally on stories, and but I had never seen her, and it was a joy to see her. She's grown into this, you know, she had a lot of years of very painful operations and skin grafts, and she thought she would never find a husband, and she was scarred for life. She met a guy, a Vietnamese guy who was also studying with her in Cuba, and they defected and ended up living in Canada, and she's now got a foundation that looks after kids who have experienced the ravages of war, and is just a sweet, wonderful person. And it was amazing. We walked down the sidewalk in M Street in Georgetown last year, and into the evening, the three of us sort of arm in arm, and it was just this 37-year loop that finally got closed. I felt really great to have finally seen her again. What is the
Oscar for a photojournalist?
Well, there are a couple. There is the one that everybody, including my brother, who is always bugging me because I haven't won it, is the Pulitzer, which is it's awarded for the last, I don't know, 80 or 90 years by Columbia University School of Journalism, and it's for newspaper and daily news photography. And I've never worked for a newspaper, so technically I've never even been eligible to win a Pulitzer.
Well, tell that to your brother.
If you tell my brother, he'll listen. If I tell him, he won't
Pay
listen.
attention. He's never had an opportunity. He doesn't have the right employer. That's all it is.
It's a matter of employment. But there's an international contest based in Holland called World Press Photo, which nowadays gets something like 80,000 entries a year. And I did win that one in 1979,
Wow.
or 1980. And that is really, and to me that's, in many ways, it's one of the most important and maybe heartfelt, because it represents photographers from every country. And it's completely international, and one year it'll be a winner from India, and the next year from Italy, and China. I mean, it's a very international group, and the level of the photography is really something. I've actually judged it a couple of times too, and it's hard to make a choice.
I would think so. Did you ever have, when you were, come back to Bob Marley for a moment,
yeah.
When you were photographing him, did you have any idea this would lead to almost a second career? You got a book on him? I mean, these fabulous photographs we're surrounded by today.
It really took, it took a little, one of those little flip the light switch on moments for me through my daughter. Now, as it happens, my daughter, who February 6th, 2010, will be 24 years old, she shares a birthday with Bob Marley.
Really?
This will be Bob Marley's would have been his 65th birthday. I mean, kind of like everybody, I talk about him like he's still here, because in many ways his presence
Well,
is
it's hard to realize that he isn't. He was such a strong person.
And people, I think people really feel that presence even today. She had, about 5 years ago when she was still in college, living in the dorm, and I went to visit her one day, and she had spent part of the previous summer working at my agency in New York, where all my pictures are libraried up, contact press images. And that summer, one of the things they had her do as the young intern, the partner's kid, we got to give her a job.
Right.
So she goes through and she sorts through this stack of prints of Jamaica, reggae, and Bob Marley. So she, by the end of her time there, she really knew these pictures pretty well. So I go to visit her the next September, and she grabs me by the hand and says, Dad, you gotta come see this. We go running down to the hall to her friend's room, and we walk inside, and there is this big poster. I don't know, we never really have managed to figure out how they got this picture, because we didn't really sell this. But it's the picture that's on the cover of Soul Rebel, of Bob leaning on a guitar with this beautiful look on his face, just looking very content.
I'm looking at it over your shoulder, by the way, yes.
And she said, Dad, that's your picture. I know that's your picture. I saw it this summer. And I looked at it and I said, it's definitely my picture. Of course it is. I know that picture. And her friend, whose room it was, who owned the poster, was just kind of, jaw agape. Was like, oh my God, you knew Bob Marley. And there was something in that moment that really touched me, that these were 19, 20-year-old kids who were born 5 years after Bob Marley died.
Wow.
And for whom his presence and his music and his message was as fresh as if he were still being heard on the radio live every day.
You took another photograph that I talked about, the picture of Kim Phuc in Vietnam that you did not take, but you took one that has always been an icon for me, and that was a picture, I don't even know if you remember it, Mary Decker, the runner.
Oh, I remember.
Do you?
That's probably my most published picture, actually. It was from the 1984 Olympic Games, in what was to be the great showdown between Mary Decker, the American runner, who, because 4 years before the U.S. had boycotted the Moscow Olympic Games, so she had missed her chance for gold in 1980 and was hoping that 1984 would be her year. And Zola Budd, the young barefoot runner from South Africa, who, because South Africa was not allowed in the games, had to run, because her mother was British, she was able to get a British passport and ran for the UK. And it was the girl who's supposed to win and the girl who might win, and they were in this big race in the final, and at one point Zola passed to try and take the lead, and she cut back a little early, and her feet and Mary's feet collided, and Mary went down.
Oh, I remember watching that. But that picture, you just see that she's devastated.
There was everything in that face. And even in front of a crowd of 100,000 people and a TV audience in the millions, I felt like I was almost like a voyeur in a way. That this was like this incredibly private moment of pain, but in public, in a public forum, they couldn't have it any more public.
Her soul was open, but how do you get into the perfect position? We got less than a minute. It's a terrible thing to ask you.
Well, you know, sometimes it's just where fate, where fate takes you. I had been spending a lot of that week in track and field, elbowing my way for a position at the finish line with every other photographer who had 10 times as many cameras and tripods and everything. And for that last afternoon, I just said, the heck with it. I want to go somewhere where I'm not going to be bothered. And I went down about 50 yards down the track, and there was one other photographer there, and I sat down and we could sit quietly and shoot our pictures, and it happened right in front of me. It's all about being there. You have to, we can't phone it in from the bar. We actually have to see it.
Exactly. David, what a pleasure to meet you, and how much I've enjoyed your photographs over the years, and the Marley book is just stunning. Thank you very much. A pleasure to be with you.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for being with us. Hope we'll see you next time as we continue to remember.